صلوا على النور يا أحمد الله نور المنازل يا محمد.
Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. They say just as our bodies need nourishment to survive, our souls need to be nourished as well. But the question is, how often do we feed our souls? Welcome to Soul Food, a podcast about spiritual refinement. My name is Amjad Tarsin, and I invite you to embark with me on this journey inward to work on our souls. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to episode 13 of Soul Food titled The Spirit. In this episode, we're going to look at the ugliness of the ego. We'll talk about the path of spiritual purification, and finally, we'll look at the levels of the soul. One of the great scholars of Islam said that the entire cosmos is all light, and the only source of darkness in it is the presence of the nafs. The Prophet ﷺ also tells us, and this shows us how destructive and damaging the nafs can be. He tells us that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the nafs, He commanded it to come forward and it turned back. And then He commanded it to go back and it came forward. In other words, it denied and contradicted the divine command. And that's the nature of all of the nufus that people have. The ego of every human being is like that until it's purified. And all of the bloodshed, the harm, the hurt that we see in the world, it emanates from the nafs. That people who have unpurified souls, it inspires them and incites them to do things that are displeasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the things that we see in the world that are ugly and oppressive, they emanate from the nafs. And even in our own dealings with other people, we find it repulsive when we see someone who is overtaken by their nafs, right? We find that they are egotistical, or that we call them narcissistic, or we find other words, and none of those things are praiseworthy and noble. But we have to keep in mind that that same potential for ugliness that we recognize so easily in other people, it actually exists within us as well. And the stories that we have in the Quran, the story of Iblis, of the devil, of the Pharaoh, all of these archetypes and all of these stories, they're real stories, but they tell us about the same tendencies that exist within us. And they repeat and reoccur throughout history. And Iman, pure faith, is what actually brings out the beauty of the soul. And the greatest accomplishment you can ever achieve in reality is to become an actualized servant of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That you become colored with Iman, that you become beautified, and your soul actually becomes whole once again. That the nafs ruptures it and scars it, but through Iman, you are restored. And you attain and accomplish this greatest achievement of being completely aligned with your Creator, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah tells us in the Quran about those who reject faith and how they have these spiritual diseases that fester and metastasize within them. He says, Jalla Jalalu, وَإِذَا مَا أُنزِلَتْ سُورَةٌ فَمِنْهُمْ مَنْ يَقُولُ أَيُّكُمْ زَادَتْهُ هَذِهِ إِيمَانًا. Whenever a surah is revealed, some of them ask mockingly, which of you has this increased in faith? فَأَمَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا فَزَادَتْهُمْ إِيمَانًا وَهُمْ يَسْتَبْشِرُونَ. As for the believers, it has increased them in faith and they rejoice. وَأَمَّا الَّذِينَ فِي قُلُوبِهِمْ مَرَضٌ فَزَادَتْهُمْ رِجْسًا إِلَى رِجْسِهِمْ. But as for those with sickness in their hearts, It has increased them only in wickedness upon their wickedness. وَمَاتُوا وَهُمْ كَافِرُونَ. And they die as disbelievers. May Allah protect us from that. So this verse teaches us that the wickedness of the nafs intensifies if it's not dealt with, that their disbelief and their arrogance, it only added wickedness on top of their wickedness. And the nafs is so tricky and so destructive that it can make you deluded to the point that you attribute perfection to yourself. And it has even taken people to the point of attributing divinity to themselves. When the Pharaoh said, "Ana rabbukum al-a'la," I am your exalted Lord. Who are you worshiping? Who's this God that you're worshiping? I'm your exalted Lord. Because he was so overtaken by his nafs. So we have to work really hard to tap into the beauty of the soul, the beauty of the fitrah. And that beauty comes out through the light of Iman. And it is restored through the realities of faith and believing in Allah and adorning ourselves with acts of devotion and acts of faith and purifying our nufus. Which brings us to the next point. The word ihsan, the word used for the spiritual discipline within Islam, which is ihsan, taken from the hadith of the Prophet, it means to make something beautiful. And the spiritual path of purifying your heart, it beautifies your inner being. It beautifies your character. It attunes you to the heavenly realm. It aligns you with your creator and his divine will, subhanahu wa ta'ala. Your heart is a jewel, and the nafs is like a corrosive material that damages that jewel. But through spiritual purification, the beauty of the jewel begins to shine again. Imam al-Ghazali says, rahimahullah, that your heart is like a mirror that is meant to reflect divine lights. But if that mirror is corroded and rusted, it won't reflect anything. And he says these are like people who deny the reality of Allah's existence. Their hearts are blind. Their mirror is corrupted. It is corroded. And then he says another situation could be if the mirror is deformed. If you have, when you go to like an amusement park or something like that, they have these mirrors that make you look taller than you are or wider than you really are. These funny mirrors. If the mirror is deformed, it actually won't reflect the correct image. It won't show the image as it truly appears. And this is like people who have false understandings of Allah and that they attribute things to Allah that are not suitable for Him. They have misunderstandings and false beliefs. And this is why the spiritual path is so important, because it actually cleanses that mirror. It removes the rust from that mirror. It straightens out the image. It redirects that mirror to face the source of all of these lights, which is revelation, which is the Quran, which is the example and the sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But without the spiritual path and with the destructive nature of the nafs, none of that will actually really be accessed. And this brings us to the final point. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran about the levels of the soul, the levels of the nafs. And it shows us the degrees of the path of purification, that you start off in this very raw and crude form of the nafs, but then it develops. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in Surah Yusuf of the first level of the nafs. وَمَا أُبَرِّئُ نَفْسِي إِنَّ النَّفْسَ لَأَمَّارَةٌ بِالسُّوءِ إِلَّا مَا رَحِمَ رَبِّي. And I do not seek to free myself from blame, for indeed the lower self, the nafs, is ever inclined to evil. That's a nafs al-ammara bis-su'. This is the first level. the nafs that is ever inclined to evil, except those shown mercy by my Lord. So this is the lowest level of the nafs, the state of the nafs without divine guidance. And this is the nafs of the vast majority of people. All the violence, the injustice, the evil that we see in the world, it stems from this unruly and crude form of the nafs. But by following the path of the prophets, by connecting with our Creator, it becomes more refined. And the path is not easy. It's something that is extremely difficult, but it is worthwhile. And it is the most important thing that you can do in your life. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us when someone commits to that, then the next level of their soul, which is more praiseworthy, it's not completely there, but that a person is making serious progress. And it's no longer this lower self that is ever inclining to evil. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا أُقْسِمُ بِالنَّفْسِ اللَّوَّامَةِ, and I swear by the self-reproaching soul, النَّفْس اللَّوَّامَةِ. And this is the soul that blames itself when a person does something wrong. And it becomes a little bit more purified. So if you do something wrong, you hear this voice within you, this internal dialogue. You say, I shouldn't have done that. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not pleased with that. I shouldn't have insulted that person. I shouldn't have lied. I shouldn't have delayed my prayer. You start to have this internal guilt, which is a sign that your heart is alive and that it's moving in the right direction. But your nafs, even though it's been purified a little bit, there's still work to do, and it can easily revert to its old ways and become the nafs al-ammara bis-su, that is ever inclined to evil. So you have to keep working at it. And it's a lifelong battle, but the result is beautiful. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala finally tells us of the last level of the soul, the stage of the soul when it's become purified. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ayyatuha nafsul mutma'inna. Allah will say to the righteous, O tranquil soul, ارجعي إلى ربك راضية مرضية. Return to your Lord, well pleased with him and well pleasing to him. فادخلي في عبادي وادخلي جنتي. So join my servants and enter my garden of paradise. Now imagine hearing that from the all-merciful Lord as your soul leaves your body and you transition into the next life. There is a time where we all will have to leave this world. For those who purified their souls in preparation for the meeting with Allah, it will be a most beautiful end, which is then followed by beauty and reward that exceeds the bounds of imagination. So these are the levels of the soul. And we cannot risk leaving our soul unrefined and unruly and in its crudest form of the soul that ever inclines to evil. We have to work and we have to aspire to attaining that highest level, which brings us to the call to action. And I'll share with you one of my favorite passages of all. And it's from Imam al-Ghazali's Minhaj al-Abidin, which we covered in season 5 of Soul Food. It gives us the perspective we need to think about this spiritual path. He says, فَكَيْفَ حَالُ مَنْ يَطْلُبُ الْمُلْكَ الْكَبِيرِ فِي دَارِ النَّعِيمِ الْخَالِدِ الْمُقِيمِ. How should the state then be of one who seeks the great kingdom in the everlasting abode of bliss? أيستكثر مع ذلك أن يصلي ركعتين لله تعالى? Is it too much for him to pray 2 rak'ahs for Allah's sake subhanahu wa ta'ala? أو أن ينفق درهمين أو يسهر ليلتين? Or is it too much for him to donate 2 silver coins or to stay awake for 2 nights in prayer? كلا بل لو كان له ألف نفس وألف ألف روح وألف ألف عمر. On the contrary, in fact, had he 1,000,000 souls and 1,000,000 spirits and 1,000,000 lifetimes, كل عمر مثل عمر الدنيا وأكثر, each lifetime as long as the existence of the earth or even longer, فبذل ذلك كله في هذا المطلوب العزيز لكان ذلك قليلا. And he spent all of those souls and all of those spirits and all of those lifetimes, he spent all of them in this mighty pursuit. That would be a small price to pay. فتنبه أيها المسكين من رقدة الغافلين. So wake up, O poor soul, from the sleep of the heedless. And that really gives us an understanding as we transition into the call to action tonight. Don't delay. Tonight, set aside a time and pray 2 rak'ahs. Or alternatively, if you can't pray, make dua for 5 minutes. And pray those 2 rak'ahs or make that dua with the intention that Allah beautifies your soul and He makes you of those He calls out to at your appointed time. And He says, "O tranquil soul, come back to me. Enter with my servants and enter into my garden of paradise." Pray those 2 rak'ahs and spend that time asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give you that most noble goal and objective. And then you will see the doors of facilitation that He will open. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for tawfiq. Wa sallallahu wa sallam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen.
Thank you for listening to Soul Food. To subscribe to the show, visit soulfood.fm or search for Soul Food in your favorite podcast player. And while you're there, take a minute to leave us a rating and a review. It helps more people discover the show.